Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to be going over every single country's worst World Cup performance. Quite a while ago, I did a tier list ranking every country's best World Cup performance, and you guys really seem to enjoy that, so I'm going to be going over something similar. Well, somewhat. It's literally the complete opposite of what I went over last time, and also, I think it's a bit weird to do a tier list of the worst World Cup runs. So I'll just be going over each one without actually ranking them. Now, if you're wondering why you haven't heard your country mentioned in this video, it's because you have not qualified for a World Cup yet. Don't forget to leave an early like. Let's try to hit 4,000 likes on this video. Subscribe if you're new, and let's get into it. Mostly going in alphabetical order, but probably with a few mismatches here and there. Starting with Algeria, their worst ever World Cup was in 1986, just after a heartbreaking debut in 1982. They were put in a very tough group, having to face Brazil, Spain, and Northern Ireland, finishing last place. They only got 1 point, and you can probably guess who that was against. Moving on to another African country, they've only played in one World Cup before though, Angola. It was in 2006 where they got grouped with a 3rd place finish with 2 points. And to be fair to them, it was pretty impressive as they kept every single match close. Their only loss was to Portugal 1-0, but that being said, their only goal in the tournament was against Iran. Moving on to the most recent World Cup champions, Argentina. Their worst performance was in 1958. It started off hopeful with them scoring 3 minutes into their first match against Germany, but Germany responded with 3 goals, giving them their first loss. Argentina came back very strong against Northern Ireland though, defeating them with the same exact scoreline. But then they suffered one of their biggest ever defeats in history actually, losing to Czechoslovakia 6-1. To be fair, they did score a goal in every single game, and Corbata scored in each of the matches. But that being said, this was by far their worst ever display in World Cup history. Next up, Australia. Their worst ever record in the World Cup was 3-for-3 losses, obviously resulting them getting grouped in 2014. It was a very difficult group though, and the country still had many exciting moments. Tim Cahill scored a screamer against the Netherlands with that perfect volley, and the match was a thriller, finishing 2-3. The Aussies were even up at 1.21. They did, however, concede 3 goals in every single match. But although it seemed like on the surface it was a tournament to forget, it really wasn't. Austria got 3rd place in 1954, but one World Cup later in 1958, they went winless, scoring no goals against Brazil and the Soviet Union. But then they decided to turn up a gear against England, getting 2 goals and picking up a draw against them. Bosnia's only World Cup since the breakup of Yugoslavia was in 2014. They got knocked out of the group stage, but still got a solid win against Iran, defeating them 3-1. Their losses against Argentina and Nigeria were very narrow and unfortunate. Belgium's worst World Cup was not the last one. They got a win there. Their worst performance was actually in the very first tournament in 1930. No wins and 2 losses since their group was only made of 3. They got demolished to the United States 3-0 and then a 1-0 loss to Paraguay. Bolivia have only played in 3 World Cups, but they were all a group stage exit. In the first ever World Cup in 1930, they played 2 matches, losing to both Brazil and Yugoslavia 4-0 each. But in 1950, they only played 1 match, as France were supposed to be in their group as well, but withdrew from the tournament. Their 1 match against Uruguay finished 8-0, combining both of those 1930 results. Imagine if France stayed in this tournament as well. It could have been one of the worst World Cup displays in history. We'll get into the actual worst World Cup display later though. Bulgaria qualified for every single World Cup between 1962 and 1974, and unfortunately in all 4 of those tournaments, they finished in the group stage. Their worst display though was in 1966, where they got 3-for-3 losses, and when you look at that group, you can't fault them too much. Essentially the group of death there, as Hungary were much stronger back in the day. Anyway, they were a punching bag for some legends. Pele and Eusebio scored against them, while scoring none back. They did score against Hungary on that final day, but did blow their 1-0 lead in the first half. Moving on to the only country that has played in every single World Cup, Brazil. They've only been grouped twice, in the first World Cup and in 1966. 1966 was definitely worse. In that same group we talked about with Bulgaria, they actually only won their opening match against them. The other results finished in 3-1 defeats. Definitely the shock of the tournament though, as prior to this, they were back-to-back World Cup champions. But a huge reason why the team fumbled so hard is because Pele got injured during the tournament. They responded beautifully after that, winning yet another World Cup in 1970. Honestly, considering that this country have played in every single World Cup, and this was their worst ever display, it's pretty impressive. And no, I'm not putting their 7-1 against Germany, although that was really something else. Sure, it was on their own home soil, and we have never seen such a hefty semi-final scoreline like that before, but they still made it to the semi-finals. Cameroon have failed to make it past the group stage in 7 different World Cups, but their worst run by far was in 2014. At first only losing 1-0 to Mexico, but then conceding 4 to Croatia and then Brazil as well, a total of 9 by the end. What's crazy is that this was Matip's last tournament with the national team, and pretty much the end of his international career. He only played one more match in the AFCON qualifiers against Gambia a year later. Canada's latest World Cup performance was not their worst, despite finishing with no wins. They broke history in that tournament to score their first ever World Cup goal. Although their loss against Croatia was the most goals they ever conceded at a World Cup, their worst display was in their first tournament in 1986, where they conceded a total of 5 goals but also scored none, losing to the Soviet Union, France, and Hungary. Chile's worst display happened in 1982. No crazy scoreline defeats, but 3-for-3 losses against Austria, Germany, and Algeria. Their match against Algeria finished 3-2. China in 2002 played in their only World Cup and did not get a single win, losing to Costa Rica 2-0, Turkey 3-0, and Brazil 4-0. Yup, no goals scored. Nothing we are unfamiliar to though. Colombia's worst World Cup was also in their debut in 1962. It was oddly a remarkable campaign though, first losing to Uruguay 2-1, but then drawing with the Soviet Union 4-4. Keep in mind, they were 3-0 down by the 11th minute. Also keep in mind, they scored past 4 what was considered the best goalkeeper at the time, Yashin. Also, this match broke history, where we saw the first ever goal scored directly from a corner kick in a World Cup. Unfortunately, after that solid fight, they got annihilated by Yugoslavia 5-0 at the end. No wins, 1 draw, and 2 losses. Most of us know Costa Rica's best ever World Cup. It was unforgettable for many. But their worst tournament came in 2006. It was the only time they failed to grab a single point at the tournament. To be fair, there were some interesting fights, scoring 2 goals against Germany but getting outplayed still, to having a lead against Poland at one point, but their 3-0 defeat to Ecuador was forgetful for them. Now staying on topic with CONCACAF, Cuba's only World Cup was in 1938, and back then there was no group stage. It definitely had an interesting start, where they had to face Romania in their first matchup, and it finished 3-3. A match that went to extra time but no penalty shootout, as there were just no penalty shootouts back then in the World Cup. The first time the tournament featured a penalty shootout was in 1982, so instead of settling the tie that way, the countries faced each other once again 4 days later, where Cuba were able to grab a 2-1 victory. Making good progress, it all went downhill in the quarterfinals, losing to Sweden 8-0, and since then have seemed to be forgotten by majority of the football world. Croatia finished top 3 in 3 different World Cups, but also got knocked out in the group stage 3 times. 2006 was the only time they went winless in the tournament, but still picked up 2 draws. They kept it narrow with Brazil at the beginning, with a great strike from Kaká, then a goalless draw with Japan, but then saved all their goal scoring for the final match against Australia, which they still did not win. A 2-minute free kick from Cerna, then conceding a penalty, but Australia's goalkeeper had butterfingers against Niko Kovac's strike. They strived to hold on to that 2-1 lead, which would have secured them a spot to the knockouts, but they did concede an equalizer in the 79th minute. This match in particular went down in history for a referee error though. Šimunić got booked for a yellow twice and never got sent off, only receiving a 3rd yellow towards the end of the game. Czech Republic's worst World Cup was also in 2006, because this was the only World Cup they qualified for since the split up of Czechoslovakia. It was actually a massive letdown of a performance, as this was a great generation of players they possessed, and they were 2nd in the FIFA rankings. They started off strong with the 3-0 victory over the USA, but crumbled in their last 2 games, losing to both Ghana and Italy 2-0. And Ghana just made their debut in the World Cup as well. Denmark's has to be their shocking performance in Qatar not too long ago. Their only World Cup where they went winless, after everyone said that they would be the dark horse of the tournament. It definitely was a shock. After making it to the semi-finals of the Euros, they finished last in not the worst looking group, only picking up 1 point against Tunisia at the beginning, followed with giving Australia one of their most memorable World Cup nights. They only scored 1 goal, surprisingly, against France. DR Congo's only World Cup was when they played as Zaire, and it was the 2nd worst World Cup performance in history. A -14 goal difference, and they scored no goals. It featured a 2-0 defeat to Scotland, a 3-0 defeat to Brazil, but then a 9-0 loss to Yugoslavia. This was the worst World Cup defeat in history, but we do have one later coming up that did go to the double digits. Ecuador got grouped 3 times. In 2014 and 2022, it was unlucky for them though, as they got 1 win, 1 draw, and 1 loss. Their debut in 2002 saw them get 1 win and 2 losses though, in a group with Italy, Mexico, and Croatia. Their only victory was at the end against Croatia. Egypt, despite holding the most AFCON titles, have never made it out of the group stage at a World Cup before. Their worst performance was during the rise of Salah in the 2018 World Cup. After his first season at Liverpool, many were hoping he could deliver for his nation. Although he did score 2 goals, they lost every match, in a group with the hosts Russia, Uruguay, and Saudi Arabia. Now let's move on to a country who arguably had the worst ever World Cup defeat in history, El Salvador. Both of their World Cups in 1970 and 1982 only finished with losses, but 1982 had that match I'm talking about in particular. No one was expecting much from the draw they got. But in their very first match, they conceded 10 goals, but at least scored 1. It's the only goal they've been able to score at a World Cup, but in a match the nation obviously wants to forget about. The other 2 defeats were not as extreme, but El Salvador at the time of this recording are the only country to concede 10 goals in a single World Cup match. Moving on to England, one year where it was nowhere near to coming home was in 2014. It was their second ever winless World Cup, where they lost to Italy and Uruguay and drew with the group winners Costa Rica. It was a difficult group, of course, but when you're England with the quality you have on your side, there's just no excuse. All respect to their manager at the time, Roy Hodgson, but he got heavily exposed even more in Euro 2016. France had 2 World Cups past the 2000s where they finished the campaign with no wins, 1 draw, and 2 losses. It happened in 2002 and 2010. Although 2010 comes into mind as it was more recent, I would argue 2002 was worse, as they did not score a single goal in the tournament while being previous champions in 1998 and also winning the Euros in 2000. All of that while having the likes of Zidane plus many more notable legends to the game. Also keep in mind their group now might look tough on the surface, but Senegal back then were actually much weaker than they are today. They were massive underdogs of the tournament as they were making their debut and beat world champions France in their opening match. Credit to them, they made it to the quarterfinals in their first ever tournament, but France were left speechless. Germany holds a somewhat similar story to France. After winning the World Cup in 2014, they got grouped in 2018 and in 2022. Their first shock in 2018 was definitely worse though, as it's always a shock for the champions to get knocked out so early. But also their record was worse, with 2 losses and just 1 win against Sweden. Looking at that group as well, it looked more doable on paper compared to their group in Qatar. It started with a 1-0 Mexico loss, then that victory against Sweden thanks to Toni Kroos' stoppage time free kick, but stoppage time haunts them against South Korea, as their opposition not only scored 1 but 2 goals after 90 minutes, heartbreaking the Germans massively. This was their first time getting grouped in the tournament's history, and despite the success in 2014, it was a sign that new management was needed. Unfortunately, it's taken some time for them to find a new one, and like I said, 2022 wasn't so pretty either. Ghana impressed in their first 2 World Cups, where in 2006 and 2010, they made it to the knockouts. Impressively, they qualified for 3 World Cups in a row, but their last one in 2014 was their downfall. It wasn't the worst display ever for sure, close fights all around, and they scored in every match they played. Their only found memory in that World Cup was drawing to the champions that year, Germany 2-2. Other than that, 2 1-0 losses to the USA and Portugal as well. Greece have told the craziest international underdog story, but that was just in Europe, not the whole world. Their debut in the World Cup was in 1994, and they did not score a single goal, losing to both Argentina and Bulgaria 4-0 and Nigeria 2-0. But this tournament was part of the reason why their Euro 2004 success was so spectacular. This and Euro 1982 were their only 2 major international tournament displays prior to Euro 2004, where they did not get a single win. Haiti's one and only World Cup went very poorly. Their group in 1974 was insane, to be fair. Back then, Poland were an incredible national team. They got demolished by them 7-0 and lost to Italy 3-1 and Argentina 4-1. At least they scored 2 goals. And the one impressive thing about their campaign is at least at one point they did have a lead over Italy. Honduras never made it out of the group stage, but their worst run was in 2014. 3-for-3 losses in a group with France, Switzerland, and Ecuador, only scoring 1 goal against Ecuador. Like Serbia, they are victims of a Shaqiri masterclass as he scored a hat-trick against them. Hungary used to be one of the best teams in Europe, but their decline was visible in their last 3 World Cups, failing to progress each time and haven't qualified for any since 1986. The worst of those 3 was their first one of the continuous pattern in 1978, their only time where they failed to get a single win at the World Cup. A group of death on the surface, Hungary failed to make a mark against Argentina, Italy, and France. But at least they scored a goal in each one of their matches, but regardless, they conceded 8. Iceland have only played in 1 World Cup during their golden era not too long ago, where at the time they were one of the most exciting underdogs in the international scene. A country with a population of less than 400,000, they made it to the quarterfinals of Euro 2016 and then qualified for their only World Cup in 2018. Topping their qualifier group over Croatia, Ukraine, and Turkey. Although impressive over Croatia at this phase, they were drawn together once again in the actual tournament. They lost to them on the final match day and to Nigeria 2-0 prior. But their first match against Argentina was a surprise for the world. They drew the match, where their goalkeeper, Hannes Haldrosen, saved Messi's penalty on the country's first ever World Cup match. Keep in mind, this guy was a part-time filmmaker. Honestly, you still gotta give this country props for having memorable moments this tournament while having a higher population of sheep than humans. Indonesia were the first ever Asian country to play in the World Cup. At the time, they were known as the Dutch East Indies. In the 3rd edition of the tournament, as mentioned earlier, there was no group stage. Straight to the knockouts, their opponent was Hungary, who obliterated obliterated them 6-0 and never saw an appearance in the World Cup again. Will that change in 2026? They're looking decent right now, so let's see. Iran had 3 World Cups which finished in the same record of 1 draw and 2 losses. Statistically, the worst of them was their debut in 1978, as they had the worst goal difference there, being -6, losing by 3 goals to the Netherlands and Peru, but drawing with Scotland 1-1. Iraq's only World Cup in 1986 saw 3-for-3 losses, but they were drawn in an interesting group with Mexico, Paraguay, and Belgium. They only managed to score against the European country and lost 1-0 in their other 2 matches. Against Paraguay, they had a goal that was controversially disallowed. It was still an admirable feat for the country, qualifying for the World Cup for the first time while they were undergoing a golden generation. Now, Ireland have an interesting record they can show off for. They're not the only nation to do so, we'll mention the other ones later, but they are one of the few countries to have played in multiple World Cups and never been knocked out of the group stage. Impressively, their best run reaching the quarterfinals, they did not even register a single win. The only team to ever do something like that on their debut in 1990. That's the least amount of wins they achieved in the tournament, but since they made it to the quarterfinals there, and their other finishes were in the round of 16, I cannot select it. In 1994, they got their most ever losses, so I'll be choosing that one. They finished second in that group, sharing points with everyone else, beating Italy, losing to Mexico, and then drawing with Norway. Crazy how beating Italy qualifies as your worst ever World Cup. But then in the round of 16, Ireland lost to the Netherlands 2-0. Fair play to this country for never getting knocked out of the group stage. Not many other nations can say they've done the same, but like I said, they are not the only one. Israel's only World Cup, they got 2 draws and 1 loss in 1970. They lost to Uruguay at the beginning, but then drew with Sweden and Italy. Not too memorable, apart from noting that back then, Israel were not part of UEFA. They had to qualify through a group over New Zealand and North Korea. North Korea, despite reaching the quarterfinals in the previous tournament, refused to play Israel, so they withdrew from qualification. Israel beat New Zealand both times, and then had to face Australia in the playoffs and beat them there. Now it's a bit tougher for this side, since they have to compete with all these other European nations for a World Cup spot. Italy's worst tournament has to be in 2010. After being one of the numbering defending champions to fumble, they were one of the worst victims. They failed to get a single win and finished last place in a gift of a group, drawing with Paraguay and New Zealand and losing to Slovakia 3-2 on the final match day. Those last 2 goals were incredible. Anyway, this was the first time in Italian football history that they finished a World Cup campaign with 0 wins. And as we know, it's not gone any easier for the Azzurri, failing in 2014 as well, and then missing 2018 and 2022 completely. Ivory Coast have qualified for 3 World Cups, and each one was a group stage exit. None of them were too different stat-wise from one another, but it is a massive shame that this side could not take advantage of their great generation at the time. I would argue that of the 3, 2014 was the worst one. Considering their group wasn't the toughest task on paper, it started off positive with a 2-1 victory against Japan, but then a narrow defeat to Colombia, and once again to Greece, conceding a stoppage time penalty. If they hadn't conceded that penalty, they would have been through to the knockouts instead, so it's a genuine shame. Also, we have not seen them play in a World Cup since. Jamaica's only appearance was in 1998. Despite getting a win against Japan at the end, their previous 2 matches, they were outdone. The Reggae Boys lost 3-1 to Croatia from some incredible goals, and then 5-0 to Argentina. Ortega with the brace, Batistuta with the hat-trick. Perfect timing to transition to Japan though, that was also their worst ever World Cup performance. Their defeats against Argentina and Croatia were not as heavy as Jamaica's, but losing to Jamaica at the end as well put them in last place with 3 losses. What's interesting though is that just like Jamaica, this was also Japan's World Cup debut. Japan bounced back pretty well, qualifying for every single World Cup since, unlike Jamaica. Kuwait's only tournament happened in 1982, where the most they could do was draw to Czechoslovakia at the beginning. Well, look who scored a penalty in that match though. Unfortunately, it was not a Panenka, but their goal in response was quite a beauty. The other matches finished 4-1 to France and 1-0 to England. Mexico have qualified for loads of World Cups, 17 to be exact. Unfortunately though, they also have the most amount of losses in World Cup history as well. 3 of their World Cups finished with 3-for-3 losses, 1930, 1950, and 1978. The worst of those 3, according to goal difference, was 1978 with -10, conceding loads in every match, 3 to Tunisia at the beginning, then 6 to Germany, and finally 3 to Poland. Although having some legends on the team like Hugo Sanchez, the tactical approach going into the World Cup was clearly poor. Morocco, the country to have an incredible run in Qatar, suffered 4 group stage exits prior. In 1994, they put off close fights, but lost all their matches by 1 goal. It had them finishing last place in their group containing the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, and Belgium. It was a shame as back then they were considered to have their golden generation, but a new one has clearly emerged and they're looking to write more history with the nation. Moving on now to the Netherlands, our second country in this video who have qualified for multiple World Cups and have never been eliminated in the group stage. This means that their answer is a bit boring, as they did play in the 1934 and 1938 World Cup, where they did not have a group stage in those tournaments. Both times they got knocked out in the first round, and the worst affair was in 1938, where they lost to Czechoslovakia 3-0. All the goals came in extra time as well. Now, if you want to overlook that since they only played one match, then the answer would be 1990, where they didn't win a single game, yet qualified for the round of 16. They got 3 draws in the group stage, just like Ireland did, and went on to lose to Germany 2-1 immediately. New Zealand were the only country in World Cup 2010 to finish undefeated, yet they still got knocked out in the group stage. It was an impressive run, but they did have a worse display back in 1982. Scoring 2 goals against Scotland, they still conceded 5 to them. They went on to concede 3 to the Soviet Union and 4 to Brazil. Last place with 3 losses and a -10 goal difference from the Kiwis. It's okay, as they'll most likely qualify for the 2026 World Cup. Nigeria in both 2002 and 2010 finished with a record of 1 draw and 2 losses with a -2 goal difference. Both times they were drawn with Argentina, and it seems like they do every time both qualify for the World Cup. But I would argue 2010 was a worse display given their group quality. Bottom of their group not being able to beat South Korea or Greece, while in 2002 they at least drew with England. But yeah, they gave Greece their first ever World Cup win in 2010. Northern Ireland had some alright moments in their first 2 World Cups in 1958 and 1962. But in 1986 they went winless, drawing with Algeria, losing to Spain narrowly, and getting hammered by Brazil 3-0. North Korea had a remarkable World Cup debut in 1966. Watch my tier list video ranking every country's best World Cup to learn about that. But their only other appearance was in 2010, and that one was bad. At the time, they were ranked the lowest country by FIFA to ever qualify for the World Cup. Now, I've shared this story before and some of you claimed it to be a myth, but I'll just share it quickly anyway. To avoid humiliation, the country banned live broadcast to watch this World Cup. But after putting off a very solid fight against Brazil, only losing 2-1, they decided to show the next match against Portugal. However, they lost that match 7-0, and then to the Ivory Coast 3-0, -11 goal difference, but hey, at least they scored against Brazil. Norway's second World Cup in 1994 had them finish bottom in that group where everyone shared points. Definitely unlucky there, but the only country they were able to beat and score against is Mexico. That being said, that same Mexico were the group leaders. It was definitely unfortunate, but at least in the next World Cup in 1998, they qualified for the round of 16. Unfortunately for them though, they have not seen the World Cup since, even with some of the best names in football on their squad. Panama made their World Cup debut in 2018, where they surprisingly qualified over the United States. A proud moment for the country, but they were drawn in a difficult group with Belgium, England, and Tunisia. Unfortunately, the predicted outcome came for their country, losing all their matches with a -9 goal difference. Belgium and England absolutely clean sweeping them. Paraguay, unlike Mexico, worshipped Tata Martino after their incredible 2010 World Cup run. In the other World Cups, they always managed to get a win, except for 1950. They only played 2 matches because India withdrew from the tournament shortly before it began, but they lost to Italy and drew with Sweden 2-2. But looking at it, there hasn't been a worse World Cup for them than that. 2006 was the closest, but like I said, they got a win there, and only lost 1-0 to England and Sweden. Peru finished in the group stage twice, 1982 and 2018. In 2018, they grabbed a win and actually played pretty well. Griezmann, who won the tournament with France that year, even stated Peru was one of the toughest teams in their journey to the trophy. I would definitely give it to 1982 instead. Despite holding off for 2 draws against Cameroon and Italy, they got annihilated by an incredible Polish side 5-1. Let's move on to that country though. Before we get into their worst ever tournament, let's take a minute to appreciate their first ever World Cup in 1938. They got knocked out of the first round, but lost 6-5 to Brazil. Has to be one of the highest scorelines in a World Cup. Anyway, it took some time for Poland to return. Their best years came as soon as they did though. 2 third-place finishes in 1974 and 1982, but in more modern times, 2002, 2006, 2018 all have been a group stage finish with 1 win and 2 losses, meaning we have to go to goal difference, and when it comes to that, it's 2002 with -4. They lost to South Korea and then Portugal 4-0 with a Paletta hat-trick. They redeemed themselves against the United States, winning 3-1, but by then it was too late. They were sent home early with Portugal, surprisingly the 2 European countries going home early. Was this the worst ever World Cup for Portugal though? No. Fun fact, both times they were in the same group as the USA, they got sent home early. But even in 2014, that was not their worst run. It was actually their second World Cup in 1986, a World Cup where some third-place teams advanced to the knockouts. Portugal could not even do that in a group with Morocco, England, and Poland. They beat England but lost momentum as they lost to Poland and Morocco, conceding 3 to Morocco as well. Romania's golden generation in the 90s was incredible. In the World Cup, they made it out of the group stage every single time. They've only been grouped in the World Cup twice, in the very first edition, but also in 1970. In that World Cup, they got 1 win against Czechoslovakia, but lost to both England and Brazil. Gotta give credit though, they were both close fights. In summary, Romania did not really have any terrible World Cup displays, they just need to start qualifying for them again. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia seemed to struggle in most World Cups, until they hosted it in 2018, where they made it to the quarterfinals there. But prior to that, group stage exit every single time. In 2014, they registered no wins at all. 1-1 draw to South Korea, 1-0 loss to Belgium, and then 1-1 draw to Algeria. Clearly keeping things cagey, but obviously it was an underwhelming tournament for them. Saudi Arabia finished in the group stage 5 times, but the worst of them all was definitely in 2002. Their opening match was an 8-0 defeat to Germany, close to scoring a hat-trick, followed with a single Eto'o goal conceded from Cameroon, and then Ireland put 3 past them at the end. No goals scored, 12 conceded, terrible campaign from the 2034 hosts. Scotland is the most unsuccessful national team when it comes to qualifying for the knockouts in major international tournaments. In the World Cup specifically, they've been in 8 tournaments and never saw past the group stage. I would argue that 1954, their first World Cup, was the worst of the bunch. This was definitely a weird World Cup, as although there were groups of 4, each team only played 2 of their opponents due to seeding. So Scotland only played Austria and Uruguay, avoided Czechoslovakia, but it probably would have been for the best. 1-0 loss to Austria and then 7-0 to Uruguay. The fact that it was only losses despite them not playing 3 with no goals scored, it is at the bottom. Since Serbia became a completely independent national team, they have never made it past the group stage. Even in 2006, when they were Serbia and Montenegro, they heavily disappointed there, but I will not count that as it still was not an independent Serbia national team. In 2010, we saw them defeat Germany at least. 2018, there was a victory against Costa Rica, but in 2022, nothing. Comparing their group to 2018, they only swapped Costa Rica for Cameroon. With no surprises, they couldn't get anything against Brazil, but against Switzerland, it was an entertaining match, just with them heartbroken at the end, with 2 players always fired up in this fixture. Against Cameroon, it was a 3-3 thriller of a draw, meaning they finished the group with 1 draw and 2 losses. With their incredible midfield and attack, it was a shame, as many expected them to be the dark horse of the tournament, or maybe just me. A World Cup team nobody should underestimate this year is Serbia. Senegal, like I mentioned earlier, had an incredible World Cup debut in 2002. They only played in 3 World Cups total, and the one time they did not make it out of the group stage was in 2018, in such unfortunate fashion as well. They shared points with Japan at the end, sharing stats with them across the board, even with goal difference and goals scored. The decision to have Japan advance over to second came down to yellow cards accumulated. It made Senegal the first ever country to be eliminated from the World Cup based on fair play rule. A bit harsh since their only loss was a 1-0 defeat to the group leaders Colombia. Slovakia, since becoming independent from Czechoslovakia, actually had better records in World Cups than Czech Republic. In 2010, they made it to the round of 16, drawing with New Zealand, losing to Paraguay, but then beating Italy at the end 3-2. It was a crazy match like I mentioned. Kopunek's chip to make it 3 was unreal. It had them face Netherlands in the knockouts, where they did lose 2-1. This is the 3rd country we're talking about where their worst World Cup was not a group stage exit. But at the same time, this is the only World Cup they qualified for since becoming independent, so they do have a lot of work to do. Slovenia in 2002 had a horrific debut since becoming an independent nation though. 3 for 3 losses in a group with Spain, South Africa, and Paraguay. 3 conceded against each of the Spanish-speaking countries as well. Slovenia's manager at the time, Katanec, decided to substitute midfielder Zahovic, which led to an argument that had Zahovic expelled and sent home early. Katanec also announced that he will resign after the tournament, so things clearly were not good in the dressing room. Despite South Africa getting grouped here as well, they did have a worse tournament prior in 1998. They have never made it to the knockouts, but this is their only World Cup where they got no wins registered. 3-0 to France, who they eventually got their revenge on, 1-1 draw to Denmark, and 2-2 to Saudi Arabia. Now moving on to the country with the worst ever World Cup display, South Korea. If you remember what that 1954 tournament I told you about with Scotland, each team, despite having groups of 4, were only allowed to play 2 matches. So although South Korea did not get the chance to play 3 matches, they still have the worst ever goal difference in World Cup history. -16 after losing to Hungary 9-0 and Turkey 7-0. And the fact that out of all the teams they avoided was Germany. Imagine if they had to face them as well. This was their debut tournament and the 2nd ever Asian country to play in the World Cup. But along with Indonesia, they disappointed as well. But obviously the country did just finish a 3-year-long war. Spain's worst tournament was during the Champions Curse era. After winning in 2010, they got grouped in 2014. Their opening match was a disaster, losing 5-1 to the Netherlands, a brilliant comeback from the Dutch after Spain won the World Cup final over them. It followed with a 2-0 loss to Chile, but at least got to score 3 against the Aussies. At that point though, it was truly a consolation match, as after their loss to Chile, it was confirmed that they would not qualify for the knockouts. Sweden in 1990 only got losses in a group with Brazil, Costa Rica, and Scotland. Close fights, only losing by 1 each time, but losses nevertheless. To their credit, out of the 12 World Cups played in, they only got knocked out of the group stage twice, also in 1970. In 1962 and 1966, Switzerland got no wins or draws as well, only losses. Both had a bad goal difference as well, but the worst of the two was 1966. One hell of a group they were put in. The confidence went down the drain after their first match against Germany, which finished 5-0. They scored just 1 goal against Spain, but conceded 2 to them and 2 to Argentina. Togo's only World Cup in 2006 also had 3-for-3 losses. Switzerland this edition topped their group, even over France. Togo scored their only goal against South Korea at the beginning, but conceded 2 goals to each of the teams they faced. Adebayor unfortunately did not make much of an impact, but at least we saw him at the world's biggest tournament. Tunisia have never made it out of the group stage in a World Cup, and they qualified for 6 tournaments. Between 1998 to 2006, they never got a win either, always 1 draw and 2 losses. The worst of the goal differences occurred in 2002, 4th place losing to Russia and Japan 2-0, while drawing with Belgium 1-1. Random but fun fact, Tunisia's first ever World Cup win was against Mexico in 1978. That was their debut in the tournament, and it took them 40 years to get their second win against Panama in 2018. Turkey's worst World Cup was in that same group I talked about with South Korea in 1954. Although they defeated South Korea 7-0, they lost to Germany 4-1 before. They were not able to play Hungary, so they had to face against Germany once again to see who would qualify for the knockouts. And Germany won 7-2, meaning they scored a total of 10 goals while conceding 11, while getting knocked out of the group stage as well. Some interesting debut. Turkey's only other World Cup was in 2002, where they got 3rd place. So we have to make a tournament where they want to match 7-0, their worst ever one. Trinidad and Tobago's only appearance was in 2006. They did not score a single goal in the tournament, with 1 0-0 draw against Sweden. In their next match against England, they lost 2-0, but were able to hold them off from scoring for 83 minutes. But then another 2-0 defeat against Paraguay followed. UAE's only World Cup in 1990 had 3-for-3 losses, with 2 goals scored and 11 conceded. 2-0 loss to Colombia at the beginning, and against the European countries in their group put a total of 9 past them. Unfortunately, they were the punching bag of the group. Ukraine have surprisingly only qualified for 1 World Cup since becoming independent, and they made it all the way to the quarterfinals in 2006. They lost 4-0 to Spain at the beginning, but kept their head up going forward, scoring 4 past Saudi Arabia in the next match, and then defeated Tunisia 1-0. After that, they had what was considered one of the most boring World Cup matches in history against Switzerland in the round of 16. 0-0 going to penalties, and they defeated the Swiss on the shootout. Quarterfinal exit happened though after a 3-0 loss to the eventual champions that year, Italy. This makes them the 4th country in this video to not have their worst ever World Cup run be a group stage finish. And they also had the best worst World Cup run. Then again, they need to qualify for more. The first ever World Cup champions, Uruguay, had their nightmare happen in 1974. In a group filled with European nations, they fumbled hard, getting clean sweep by the Netherlands and Sweden and picking up a draw against Bulgaria. They failed to qualify for the next 2 World Cups, so it was worrying times for this nation. The United States' worst display was in 1990, where they had a 40-year drought to qualify for the World Cup once again. It was not the best return, where they lost to every team they faced. The worst result being against Czechoslovakia 5-1 at the beginning. The European dominance didn't end, with Italy and Austria picking up narrow results as well. And finally, Wales. Their last World Cup was their 2nd ever tournament, and it was their worst one. In what should have been a nice international send-off for Gareth Bale was instead a tragic one. In what was a doable group on paper for any of the teams below England, they could not beat a single one. Draw with the USA at the beginning, a loss to Iran which didn't help from their goalkeeper's red card in that match, and a loss to England. Their only goal was a Bale penalty against the USA. Well, there you have it, guys. There is every single country that has qualified for the World Cup's worst ever run. Obviously, some countries I went into more detail than others. There was a lot to go through, so I apologize if I did not highlight some significant moment in that worst World Cup. Feel free to let me know any information I missed in the comments below. I love learning from you guys as well. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. I will see you all very, very soon. Take care. La cu noci.